A while ago, I made a short video, how to R-hop ADHD edition. And I got a couple complaints like, that's not a tutorial, dude. That's just a slideshow. I was asked to make a more in-depth tutorial on R-hopping. I'm just going to talk about how I do it. This is not going to apply that much to you guys who make your own patches. This is really about using Elvish Tac patches. And I have a great example to do this video with because it's an EDGI barrel. And we'll see why this is a good example in a bit. So in that short video, I talked about scuffing the window. You can use a engraver, or you can use sandpaper, or you can use a sharp file, but you really just don't want the surface to be this smooth. You really want to kind of scuff it up a little bit. The super glue has an easier time bonding to a scuffed surface than a mirror smooth surface like you'll get on an EDGI. Don't underestimate the practicality of some Polar Star macro line. I like to use an engraver just because it's fast. Just be careful when you do this. You don't put too much pressure on the surface that's closest to the center of this window because it's actually quite sharp. So there is a very thin portion there that you can actually bend inward and cause a bunch of problems. So I really just try to scuff the outer half of the window, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So the inner half of that surface is still smooth just because I don't want to bend it inward and make contact with the BB. That'd be bad. Cherry pick the patch. I'm going to spend the most time talking about this specific thing. I have a top view and a side view of a inner barrel, and I have a front view and a side view of a Elvish Tac patch. The first thing I want to address is tolerance stacking. You have tolerances of the patch and you have tolerances of the inner barrel. If you don't know what tolerance stacking is, just look it up. This is not an engineering course. This is just how I R-hop barrels. But because tolerance stacking exists and it's a thing, you really have to cherry pick a patch. If you have a patch who's really short, like it's the most short it can still be while still passing quality control, and you try to pair that with an inner barrel of whose window cut is as tall as it can be while still passing its quality control, you are now stacking tolerances poorly, and you're gonna have a patch that's like way too small for the window cutout. And then you might become one of the naysayers of the Elvish Tac patch and say that it's a bad product. But it's actually not a bad product. These are really good. These have pretty tight tolerances. It's still very important that I cherry pick the patch and see how it fits before I start gluing stuff. Because if this patch does not work in this barrel, I can set it aside and maybe use it in a different EDGI barrel that has different tolerances. Another thing to note is that a brand like EDGI, these are almost handmade once you get to the finishing phase. These are going to have looser tolerances being a precision-made, handcrafted product as opposed to some off-of-the-mill barrel. There's a couple of dimensions that you really want to look for when cherry picking your patch. One is you want to make sure that the length of your patch, again, this is a side view. You're looking at the patch from the side, almost as if like it's on the barrel. And these are not to scale. This length should be the same exact length as this length. If it's too long, it's not going to fit. You'll have to trim the patch, or you'll have to file material away from the barrel, which some people do anyway because they want ER hops. It's a thing to think about. If it's too short, you could be introducing a gap in this window such that when you go to put your bucking on and you use silicone to assemble your hop-up assembly, you're introducing silicone into the inner barrel and disrupting the friction that is supposed to exist between the BB and the R-hop patch. Not good. Another thing to consider is the width of each of these little, I call them legs. You want to make sure that the length of these are the same as the length of the milled surface of the hop window. That way you don't have any leg overhanging off the barrel, or even worse, having leg overhanging into the barrel. It's more ideal for you to have as smooth of an inner surface as possible, like as seamless as possible, because the BB's making contact with everything that's inside. Everything that's outside, you know, if the patch is too thick, sand it down. There's nothing wrong with that. You're gonna have to sand anyway to kind of get rid of that excess glue, because it's in the way and it's gonna deform your bucking and cause air seal issues. Another consideration is the height granted to you here. Now, again, it's just falling into the same discussion. The inside has to be seamless no matter what. The outside, if the patch is too thick, sand it. If the patch is too thin on the outside, that might not be great. And most of the time that's indicative of just the patch overall being too small for the window. Really check the inside. Cherry pick the patch. And then we get to gluing. When we glue the patch, when we put the patch on the window, we do not want there to be any significant gap between the bottom of the leg of the patch and this surface that we're gluing it to. The super glue really needs as tiny of a gap as possible to use what's called capillary effect, to allow itself to run into that tiny capillary or channel to basically find the surface that it's ultimately going to adhere to. If you just put super glue on top of it on the desk, the top of the super glue that's exposed to the air is going to be liquid for a while. But if you can get that glue wedged between two solid surfaces, then it's going to cure a lot faster. You don't need a lot of glue. You really don't need a lot of glue. The glue that I use is what is recommended from Elvish Tac. It's the Loctite Super Glue. There's also another brand that they recommend. It's some really beefy industrial glue. I'm gonna start using that stuff eventually, but if you look on their website, they show like they're trying to pry that patch off. They use a really good glue. I should probably look into it. But the Loctite Liquid Professional Super Glue is still fantastic. I use that all the time. Just make sure you're not using stale glue. If you had a bottle that's open for a while, it's probably not going to cure as well as a brand new bottle. So always have some fresh glue on you. I like to lay down masking tape, and then I put the glue on the masking tape, and then I use a little tool to pick up the glue and put a very discreet amount where it needs to go. Pick up glue, and I just run it along the edge. You might notice it's the dark areas under the patch where the glue is flowing through. And the glue does favor the areas that are scuffed up. But right now I'm just trying to see exactly where that glue went. I want to make sure the glue did not run into the barrel. You can gently run this along the inside of the barrel to feel whether or not it dips down over the patch, or if the patch is like a step. If the patch is like a step, then that means that there's more than you need inside the barrel, and that's not good. Right now it's looking pretty good. Now before I remove any glue and start throwing silicone on this, and before I even start applying a bunch of pressure to the window, I want to put a BB in there. So those BBs just went right in. It is a 601 barrel, so it's a tight bore, and if we're more likely to find some issues with this barrel than if it were a 605, and there seems to not be much of an issue there. The BBs went right through. That's what I call the clearance check. Is there enough clearance for the BB to just roll through seamlessly? If there is, then you did something right. Nice. Sanding smooth. Use sandpapers from 400 grit and work your way up. Start 400 grit. That's really good for removing the silicone material of the patch and basically sanding it down to size. But be careful, because you can also bring down the external dimensions of the barrel itself with that sandpaper. So try to really target the patch if the patch needs to be sanded. Work your way up to as high of a grit as you have to get a nice polished finish. You can use silicone oil as a lubricant for your sandpaper to help you not tear your patch. Change your sandpaper strips frequently so that it continues to be effective, and use rubbing alcohol and a paper towel to just wipe off all the dirty silicone. As you sand that patch, you're going to have little rubber and metal particles that are accumulating inside of the silicone, and it's going to look like dirt. It's going to look like black, gray, metal dust, and you don't really want that in your barrel. And if you produce that using 400 grit sandpaper, and then you move up to 1000 grit sandpaper, that dirty silicone is containing the 400 grit sand from that sandpaper. So when you think you're actually using 1000 grit sandpaper, you're actually still almost sanding it with 400 grit to some degree, which is not completely 1000 grit. So make sure that as you progress towards your sandpapers, that you are cleaning the barrel and outside of the barrel. And every time you switch from between different grits of sandpaper, you press down on the patch, and you make sure that these legs are not lifting off of the surface that you just glued it to. And you might have to reapply glue, or even worse, take the patch off and use a different patch if you got silicone in between the legs of the patch and that surface on the barrel that you're trying to glue to. Another thing I showed in that video was clearance check. Very frequently, just take an Airsoft BB that you have and just drop it down the barrel. If this patch is obstructing a BB from traveling down the barrel at all, and if the BB does not just roll through with the slightest tilt, then that means that this patch is causing friction to the BB, which is what produces hop. So if your inner barrel with the R-hop patch is producing friction on this BB, when you're just trying to gently roll it out of the barrel, that means that when you put it in your hop-up assembly, when your hop is on 0, you're going to be hopping the BB. So you might experience overhopping even with really heavy BBs when your hop-up's on 0. So it's very important, again, that the inner surface of this patch is perfect and seamless. The outside has to be seamless too, but that can be sanded. If you don't sand it, then when you put the bucking on and you put it in the hop-up chamber, the hop-up chamber itself is actually going to be pressing down on that material, and it's going to cause your R-hop patch to be protruding inside of the barrel, and it's going to make contact with the BB when your hop's on 0, and you're going to overhop. So that's an in-depth explanation of how I do R-hops with Elvish Tac R-hop patches.